Uh, Hopefully
Wait a
it'll go
second.
live. Do I have host?
I think you're still host, or did I take it back? I can't remember. Oh, I took it back.
You're live.
I'm giving you back host again. Come on.
We're live.
Oh, damn it.
Need to put your
Gee,
share up.
Christ.
I don't need host. We're live.
It's fine. Share's out. I got the share. It should be fine now. Hello, everyone. 15th of September, dis and dat. We had a little technical issue, and I apologize. Welcome to dis and dat, another week. Time flies when we're having fun. We're going to look at a article by, oh, damn it. The share window closed. Why did it do that? It's my fault. It's my effing fault. Try this again. We'll start pages. All right. Something is wrong here. It's not sharing. There we go. Now look at this. Ugh, God. All righty. Being, becoming, subsumption, the Kantian roots of a Marxist problematic by Andres Saints de Sicilia. And the reason why I'm doing it this way is because I wanted to talk about syllogisms, but also talk about subsumption. Now, why do I want to do that? It's a kind of, a multisyllabic technical term, but it's pretty basic. It's the idea about a certain type of logic. And this logic is a useful logic. Let me try and convince you that it's a useful logic in terms of it's the key, as I think I've suggested in prior weeks, to trying to work out how it is we get to things like rent, how it is we sort of disentangle what we were looking at yesterday and the day before that in terms of issues of the difference between surplus labor and surplus profit, or the interaction or the relationship between surplus labor and surplus profit, and its relation to rent. And why is syllogism useful is because it can organize in a analytic and logical way the idea that these are, as Marx refers to them and as Hegel refers to them, as a kind of subsumption. And so we're going to look at subsumption today, a shorter article by the author. You can read his book, which nearly the same title and does the whole thing in a many pages. This one is a few pages, and I'd like to read through this today so we can move along. So elsewhere, I went for a definition of syllogism. It's a kind of reasoning with three elements: a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. It's pretty simple. And there are many types of syllogisms, and fallacies are, built from issues within the context of a syllogism, etc. So, for a syllogism to be sound, it must be both valid in structure and true in content. Now, that's sort of a general idea, and of course, you can do certain types of syllogisms that, in terms of true false tables, etc., but we're not going to do that today. In a categorical syllogism, the minor premise is the premise whose terms are the syllogism's minor term and middle term. Now, this is a minor premise, but it is also called the subsumption. And this logical idea does not go back to Hegel. It's before Hegel. But the point is that it is a way in which we can deal with premises, that is, assumptions, in order to move forward logically. And it is both a minor term and middle term. So the testimony of, here's an example, the testimony of most expert witnesses is reducible to a syllogism, even though, expert witnesses often screw it up. The expert derives a relevant opinion, that is the conclusion, by applying a general theory or technique, that is the major premise, to the specific facts of the case, which is the minor premise. So it is this relation between the major and minor premises. It suggests that there's a hierarchy, and that subsumption is part of the mechanics of it, as it were. Subsumption refers to the minor premise in a syllogism, which contains the minor term that is the subject of the conclusion. You see, so we're moving from the beginning, or the answer, as it were, the conclusion. In a syllogism, the minor premise connects the specific case to the general rule established by the major premise. So in Hegel, the major premise is about, certain type of universals, right? And we can apply dialectic to it. And of course, there's the issue of particulars. And then below that, or the result of that, or the structure of that, is what some people in a Hegelian way would refer to as the subjectivity, the ontological elements of it. Now, why is all that important? It's important because it is a kind of basis for which you distinguish between abstract and concrete. Concrete things are more about particulars. They're more about the kind of subjectivity that we're talking about, but it stems from major premises. All right, so Marxian subsumption, let's try and make it more concrete, refers to the process by which capital incorporates and transforms labor and production processes under its control. This concept is crucial in understanding how capitalism evolves and exerts influence over the two main terms, or two of the main terms, and that is both of which are material in that context: social relations and labor. Now, types of subsumption, there's a kind of formal subsumption and a real subsumption. And note, we've dealt with this question of things that are real and things that are formal in other, articulations. Shake does it. We've looked at these things before. Marx distinguishes between two main forms of subsumption: formal subsumption and real subsumption. Formal subsumption is defined as follows: this occurs when capital takes control of existing labor processes that predate the capitalist mode of production. In this phase, the labor process remains largely intact, but it is subordinated to the capitalist need to extract surplus value. So there's a certain organization, a hierarchy, however you want to talk about it, that implies a set of social relations that affects the structure of labor. The characteristics of formal subsumption are: the labor process is still recognizable and retains its previous forms. Now, forms in this context are not as concrete, they're a little more abstract. Capitalists impose, remember, we were talking about this before, capitalists impose wage labor on workers, but the fundamental nature of the work does not change significantly. The point is, of course, that ultimately the work doesn't look that different. But it is the way in which it's organized and the social relations as class elements alter that, how you deal with it. And of course, the result is to get surplus profit, surplus value, etc. The focus is on increasing absolute surplus value, primarily through extending the working day or intensifying labor. And we saw that relative to defining absolute surplus value. That is, you extend the working day or you get people to work harder. And that's a simple way of thinking about surplus value. But the surplus value, I would assert to you, is much more complicated because it is abstract. And it is at the formal level something that you've got to get straight before you deal with real subsumption, which is more concrete. It's a little further along in the process. It is, as it were, past the production or as the production process manifests itself in circulation. So real subsumption is defined as this form of subsumption involves a more profound transformation of the labor process itself. Capital reorganizes the labor process to enhance productivity and efficiency. You saw that above in absolute surplus value, often through technological advancements. And this is the crux for Marxian approaches to things that don't necessarily imply or defend a labor theory of value, but it does imply the technology, and which implies also, and there's a whole literature for it, the labor theory of value, the organic composition of capital. But what are the characteristics of real subsumption as opposed to formal subsumption? The labor process is fundamentally altered to align with the demands of capital. So in the prior example, it's not quite organized, whereas under a more real subsumption, things get a little bit more, material, real. Let's put it that way. Real is a better term to use, because formal subsumption could have things that are material, but they're not. They haven't been. They don't exist in reality, or they don't. They haven't been. They don't move, or let's put it that way. They are more static, but the static dynamic is not always the best way to refer to it. This phase emphasizes the production of relative surplus value. Remember how we did that, where capitalists innovate, which is not that different from the trying to speed up stuff and shorten the working day, etc. So, but innovation is more than that. It is this idea of obviously of technological advancement and optimized production methods. So, without talking about sort of Max-Min linear programming and all that other jazz, the point is that it's a little bit more focused on reality as opposed to the abstract. So it's more concrete. It overlaps obviously with formal subsumption, but now we're talking about real subsumption. Now this is the point or the conclusions or the movement towards the conclusion. Real subsumption reflects the integration of technology and the commodification of various aspects of life. So you can see how it's moved a little further on. It's not simply talking about subsumption, but how subsumption becomes technology and commodification and all that, leading to a more pervasive influence of capital over social relations. So there's some set of determinations going on. So what are the implications? The concept of subsumption highlights the dynamic relationship between labor and capital. As capital evolves, it not only seeks to control labor, which is what it always tries to do, but also to reshape the very nature of work and social interactions. This is very important now that we're doing, AI and a bunch of other crazy things, robots, blah, blah, blah. This transformation can lead to various forms of resistance and class struggle as workers navigate the changing landscape of labor under capitalism. That all sounds well and good. And in fact, workers have been doing this for a while. at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they're still trying to work through some of these things and are bogged down in landed property or other things that still are quasi feudal and all that stuff. So let me conclude by saying understanding Marxian subsumption is essential for analyzing contemporary labor relations, especially in the context of technological advancements and the ongoing commodification of everyday life. So that's what the AI tries to make out of this. And it's much more complicated than that, as I suggested. And you can see here in the table of contents for the book, I'm not reading from the book, I'm reading from an article that kind of synopsizes it, or at least, makes it a little bit briefer. But you can see that other elements are built in there: peer cognition, empirical concepts, judgment, which I think is a really important element. And the point of judgment, particularly from a Kantian point of view, is to get us into what I've been fiddling around with and what I've suggested over these now couple of years is that when you think about code of capital or some other kinds of ideas, whether it's Pastor or other folks, is the idea that the legal structures or judgment of some kind, rulemaking, et cetera, are all part of this process. So the complication for Kant is when you achieve aesthetic judgment questions, because at that moment, and the reason why Hegel is still involved here is that there is a certain transcendental element here that subsumption doesn't always, in fact, may not do it that much. That aesthetic judgment is also part of that. So Hegel has a critique of subsumption, and what he's doing relative to Kant is to work in a much more pure direction, something that diverges from or maybe exists in parallel to what Kant is doing. So subsumption still has a place, etc., and that's the move that Marx makes, is to try and bring practice into this materiality. So here you can see materialism, social form, and reproduction, the actuality of practice. And I think that's really important to think about, the theory of practice and the practice of theory. I know that's a little turn of the phrase, but it is, in fact, when we get to Marx, the idea of negation of the negation is this interesting, dialectic relation that we need to get sort of a sense of. And it is a constitutive relationship. That is, it's always fully integrating. Now, what we looked at in the thing I was reading before, that is from Alyssa Battistoni, is the idea of what she talks about as mediating. And so here you see in 4.2, the practical object, the mediating instrument field. This is sort of what she's talking about, although in a much more, analytic way. The natural historical being practice as production. And she actually is talking about this, but in slightly different ways, because she's framed it from the point of for the difference between human freedom and non-human freedom. And, she does an interesting idea about it because she's reflecting on the critique of classical political economy. And you can see here, against nature, reproduction, development, those are all part of the same idea. Now, the issue under capitalism, of course, is issues of abstraction, of which you can use certain types of examples. So art is always a reasonable and interesting example. It's much more complicated in language, in verbal text. So that's an issue. But anyway, the conditions of subsumption, so-called original accumulation. Remember what that means, right? There is capitalist accumulation, but there is also so-called primitive accumulation, which is original accumulation. Doesn't mean that it is class divided or whatever. It's really a reflection on modes of production. Ultimately, it's about modes of production. Exchange, then, is one way in which we can talk about a subsumption under value. That is, value is the term that is sort of not transhistorical, but it is an additional layer of meaning that we sort of have to work through. And ultimately, that's how we get to uh, uh, subsumption, formal subsumption under capital, hybrid forms, and then ultimately to real subsumption, which is where um, Battistoni winds up. I mean, she has great hopes for it and discusses all the interrelations and problematic elements of how to get there, and uses some very trenchant examples. And I think I appreciate her text for doing that. So, real subsumption, the objective positing of capitalist command. Battistoni refers to that as well. This idea that something else in the organizational elements has to be implied. And so the standard Marxian thing is to go from division of labor and manufacture to this follows the chapters, right? In capital, machinery and large scale industry. And there's a conclusion that he gets to. And the dynamic of subsumption on a social scale, historicity, and closure. Yes, that's complicated terms. They're not that complicated, although some people's eyes glaze over when you talk about it. And then, of course, there's Negri on total subsumption, subsumption in the Adorno Frankfurt School critical theory way, a subsumption as total administration, which is also something one needs to reflect on. And then, of course, rejecting periodization, particularly in the modern period, which is sort of the point of Frankfurt School critical theory, is to challenge, periodizing texts. And then, of course, systematic and reproductive totality, mediating reproduction and development. That's what Battistoni was talking about. Subjectification and living labor. Remember what she was talking about, the idea of a life and its relation to what I think is similar here is the generative dynamic. So that's a very long book up to page 242 or whatever. I've included, of course, and I'm not sure whether it makes it clear or not, but this Saints de Cecilia actually has a video that kind of compresses all this, and you may want to watch that. Whether it makes sense to you or not may be a different thing. But let me read now from the article itself, and if I don't get to the end or I get only halfway through, we'll do the rest of it tomorrow. Being, becoming, subsumption, the Kantian roots of a Marxist problematic, André Saints de Cecilia. All right, one of the fundamental tensions within Marx's writings arises from the complex relationship between the systematic and historical aspects of his description of capitalist society. A century and a half, 150 years after the publication of Capital, and in light of the historical adventures of communism that must, for the most part, be considered as an accumulation of, yes, catastrophic failures, even though there was some really existing socialism, this tension continues to both energize and attenuate the reception of Marxist thought, symptomatically expressing the radically distinctive and still illusory practical theoretical foundations of his project. On the one hand, capital is depicted by Marx as an ensemble of social relations, this is very French here, ensemble of social relations forming an apparently closed totality capable of reproducing itself purely through its own internal dynamism. That is, capital as self-sufficient system. This works into other things that refer to, self-governance and a bunch of other things. But on the other hand, Marx reminds us that the capitalist mode of production does not fall from the sky, right? Does not fall from the sky, but grows out of or violently breaks free from the economic structures of feudalism, right? This is where the reflection on original or primitive accumulation comes from, developing within and in antithesis to past relations and technologies, hence the subsumption issue of new technology. Capital as historical in nature and therefore subject to the turbulent play of conflictual energies shaping and propelling human history. Remember that Sheikh talks about turbulence. This is pretty much the same kind of turbulence, not simply defined as economic. So for Marx, the capitalist system as a whole, a totality of interlocking relations that presuppose and support one another. Yet at the same time, it's not a whole with timeless, independent, self-moving existence. It doesn't sit autonomously, right? It is an essence suspended in, it's not a whole with a timeless, independent, self-moving existence, an essence suspended in the void. Capital does not develop from nothing, but is a historical phenomenon subject to temporal emergence and decay amidst a whole host of, yes, disturbing influences. And this metaphor of turbulence or disturbing stuff, is sort of par for the course in the literature. The problem, of course, is how we define it. What are its signs? How shall we tackle it? What answer some both epistemological and ontological questions about it. But anyway, back to the text. The becoming of capital as a system is thus dependent on a mode of development that is simultaneously a negation, absorption, or negotiation of inherited social relations and forms. So, baggage is there of wealth, technology, knowledge, institutions, social roles, practices, etc. And their subordination to the logic of capital's own life process. Remember, we're talking about life process in the Battistoni text. As first and foremost, a social relation of production, Marx describes in just a few scattered fragments how capital subordinates or subsumes existing forms of production in order to configure them as capitalist valorization processes, engines of profit for their owners. So this is that moment that is, for some people, poorly described or described in, sort of arithmetic terms by Marx that we, naturally have a little problem with. Some of which is more easily defined as interest or interest rates or a bunch of other things that help us with this idea of valorization, but it obviously is a little more complicated than that. It can't be reified, as it were, as that. So anyway, I hope you're still with me. As Marx outlines, this can occur formally, simply through a transformation of the economic relationships involved in production, underpinned by the introduction of relations of exchange between buyers and sellers of labor power. So we're talking here about the labor market as opposed to the commodity market, but labor power is seen as a kind of commodity in that way, and it's to help, and wages or the wage helps define that. But subsumption under capital, Marx notes, can and does also occur in a deeper real form. So we have formal subsumption or form at some point, and then real form or real subsumption, and that they're not interchangeable terms, and I may have already confused you, which transforms the material composition of production, that is, the techniques and technology of production, as well as the products themselves. So we're still talking about production, but we also see now that labor is somewhere in there in techniques and technology of production and how you assess its relationship to that. Now, the point of the problem of labor theory of value is the measurement issue, and it can be solved. And in fact, as Sheikh looks at and Cockshot and a variety of other folks, you can actually get some measurement, but no one has sort of forced the data forward, which is, I don't know why, but, whatever. Both at the economic and material levels, Marx thus identifies the mechanisms by which specifically capitalist forms of social domination come into being, transforming existing apparatuses of production and property relations in order to secure the extraction of surplus labor from workers in the form of surplus value. It is as simple as that, but as we were looking at yesterday, we see this somewhat problematized relation, and days before, the issue of the relation between surplus profit and surplus labor. At a certain scale level, they're, as Marx describes it in the 1864 to 65 manuscripts, they're kind of close together at one level, but at another level, at scale, they diverge, or they can diverge. Let's put it that way. These formal and real modes of subsumption, along with further hybrid forms identified by Marx, it just makes it more complicated, but it's there. I would assert that it's there. And disentangling it in a language sort of way, may be more difficult, and we may have to construct other models in order to get this to work. But these formal and real modes of subsumption constitute mechanisms of domination, mechanisms through which the becoming of capital, the augmentation of its exploitative and transformative power over human life is achieved. Let me stop there. It's footnote 4. You could argue, and I'm not going to argue it here, we can argue it at some other moment, but you could say that the PMC is just simply another cog in this big wheel that does this, made more problematic in the second half of, in the 20th century. The 20th century has caused all these kinds of issues, has hybridized some of these mechanisms. The reality, of course, is, as the Frankfurt School would say, is that these are not external. They're internalized. The whole point of repression and the whole business of psychoanalysis and et cetera, is to look at how the mechanisms are not external. They're quite internal. And we exploit ourselves. Well, anyway, back to the text. Once a sufficient degree of such subsumption has occurred, once a sufficient mass of social substance has been incorporated and formed in accordance with capital's life process, then it might be said that the system is no longer simply becoming. This is an ontological thing, simply becoming, but has attained being. And remember, Sartre is building on this for a variety of other different reasons, and famously seems to stand upon its own hind legs independently of the human hands which animate it. Now, the simplistic way of looking at it, of course, is AI or robot problems or whatever, but it's much more complicated than that, because it engages the gender division of labor and blah, 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 and the PMC, et cetera. Marx describes the being of capital as an organic system, that is, a system capable of reproducing its own conditions of existence, sustaining itself through a cyclical metamorphosis which passes through a necessary sequence of stages or forms regeneratively. That's a lot of words, but it's a dynamic process that is conditioned by a whole variety of different things that we could call variables, I suppose. Yet, in distinction from other organic systems, because it's not the only organic system, capital's peculiarity is its need to expand, to accumulate. By definition, capital cannot survive by simply reproducing itself, by regenerating itself exactly as it was when its life cycle began. This is the description of that it is always trying to accumulate, and we don't necessarily attribute, evil intent, even though, at some moment, the determinations of evil sort of go by the wayside. You might not even know it's evil. And it must rather reproduce itself in an expanded form, is driven onward and outward to absorb an ever greater wealth of material that it can claim as its own through, as Marx says, commodification, the creation of the commodity. Exploitation is also part of that. Remember, we were looking at that yesterday in the economic manuscript, but also in other things, and accumulation. And note, of course, that they're in general the two accumulations that we sort of are familiar with, primitive and capitalist. That's oversimplifying it, of course. The being of capital thus implies no rest or stasis, but rather constant becoming, constant growth, a spiraling outward. Remember, we talked about spiral models, and Marx talks about this as well, that the form of growth is not a simple, cycle, but rather a spiral that, ebbs and flows or whatever, outward of its centripetal energy. You see, a spiraling outward of its centripetal energy is already a complex discussion of uh, centrifugal and centripetal energy, which runs up against multiple barriers. That is, the resistance of workers, the finitude of nature, which is also, what we're looking at last week, even its own destructive drive for insatiable accumulation. If the becoming of value toward more value, its axiomatic expression, that is, its sort of logical expansion, is systematically presupposed and necessitated by capital, how does this correlate with the other becoming of capital? It's historical becoming. You see, we're just looking at this thing of, that's sort of there, but it's only one moment in history and not the complete historical moment, which is where materialism comes back in. It's historical becoming an anticipated eventual death as a finite form of social production. When, how, and as an effect of which social forces will capital's reign over human life come to an end. So this is the tautological, teleological question, is in the Marxian sense, you're sitting there in the middle of a revolution and you're writing stuff and you're seeing that, well, it didn't work in 1848, didn't work in 49, 50, 51, 57, 62, 59, 62, 63, etc. You keep thinking, well, it's going to happen. And so we got to be prepared for it, but it's not. And similar to now where we may not have any air and water and blah, 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 blah. Revolutionary impossibilities, as is well known, for Marx, these were the first and foremost practical questions which nonetheless generated prolific theoretical reflection. In the tension which emerges between the being and becoming of capital, its organic coherence, yet historical transience, the Marxist problematic of revolution is central. That is what I just described. You've got this stuff going on and you're trying to cope with the idea that, why doesn't everybody realize that there are, terrible people in charge, people are getting exploited, why isn't something happening? And we saw some reflections on that yesterday with, in the struggle session, that there was a lot of discussion of this sort of issue. Why isn't it happening? Yes, we should all have solidarity, et cetera, et cetera. And one shouldn't be cynical about organizing in that sense. Does revolution follow a progressive arc of necessity emerging into actuality when capital's time has come? That's the question. When is capital's time coming? Or does communist revolution rather subsist within and against capital from its beginning? You can argue that from a 20th century point of view, because you could say, well, there was an actually existing socialist revolution somewhere around 1917 to 1918, and there was actual socialism at one moment. Wasn't really very good and had lots of issues, but it was interesting to see it happen, and people try to make it happen. So there's that. But going back to it may not be the way in which we need to move forward. As the ever-present possibility of overcoming that it harbors immanently within itself. So this idea of immanence is part of the subsumption stuff. The objectivist posture of the former, for which revolution follows a quasi-naturalistic or divine teleology, which is what I've been describing before and what you see critiqued in the Battistoni text, among others, independent of any individual desires and intentions, is inverted in the subjectivism, is inverted in the subjectivism of the latter. That is, I'm assuming that's about teleology, for which revolution emerges as the voluntaristic interruption of capitalist normality. Walter Benjamin's emergency brake on the train of historical progress. Now, all that sounds very poetic, and we know, Benjamin himself didn't live to see enough of that happening. Rather, for whatever reason. Well, anyway, it is a reflection, though, not only on the approaching war, but on the end of the very terrible Spanish Revolution and our Spanish Civil War. So that's all kind of going on there. In light of communism's multiple defeats and capitalism's monopolistic installation as the sole economic paradigm of the modern world system, remember we talked about monopoly capital over the last week or so, neither standpoint would appear to offer a particularly credible horizon of revolutionary anticipation. To the historical objectivist, we may ask, when? When, damn it? To the subjectivist, we may ask, by who? So we're asking a historical question: when the hell is this going to happen, and what kind of agency is going to occur? Is it a revolutionary vanguard? Is it led by whatever you make up your classes, etc.? Furthermore, in the absence of any revolutionary challenge to capital's reign, what are we to make of its unchecked development? Might capital's being-becoming approach a point of total absorption and saturation of the human life world, not only formally, but also really? So might capital's being-becoming approach a point of total absorption and saturation of the human life world, not only formally, but also really? So what does that mean? Does it mean that the transformation will occur and maybe we won't notice that it's happened? That's sort of a hope in some hybridized forms. But anyway, might this point have already been crossed, right? See, leaving us in a quote unquote post-historical abyss with no way out. Well, that's I don't want to describe what kind of regress that means, but it has analogies in psychoanalysis. Because of its implied consequences for the character and organization of production, and thereby also for the struggles that grow out of production, Marx's tentative and fragmentary conceptualization of capitalist subsumption, you see, it is tentative and fragmentary. You can see this in Marx's text that we were looking at yesterday, the Mosley Folks translation, has provided an evocative focal point for debates surrounding the transformations or death of labor-oriented revolutionary politics. And yes, that is the discussion. It still is a discussion. Collectivization has this issue, worker councils, all kinds of other stuff has this question of transformation or death of labor-oriented revolutionary politics. So you need to get a sense of how that's built, because it's built, along gender, race, north, south, blah, 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 blah. If communism is first and foremost a workers' movement, and the experience of work is shaped by the particular forms of domination operative in production, then an analysis of these forms and their evolution would seem to offer at the very least a point of departure, if not a comprehensive blueprint, well, maybe, for engaging critically with the trajectories of struggle that have the overcoming of capitalist social relations as their ultimate horizon. Horizons mean more than simply, the edge at the end. That's it has an ontological implication. It's very philosophical in that sense. The theory of capitalist subsumption, if such a theory can said to be exist. You see, this is lots of issues for folks. Compresses synoptically the central significance of the analysis of surplus value production and capital, that is, the modalities of command and exploitation. Remember, I was talking about PMC. Modalities of command and exploitation of labor ranging from the extension of the working day to the introduction of machinery and automation, right? In an account of capital's tendency to transform not only the directly social and directly economic aspects of production, with the generalization of waged work and its corresponding worker-boss power relation. See, in that one sentence, you have pretty much everything put there, right? Labor management, blah, 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 blah. But also, this is where it becomes important, but also the material and technological aspects of production with the reconfiguration of the labor process and the ascent of the machine/algorithm. See, in that one phrase, you have, the prospects or the dread of AI, et cetera, et cetera. In this way, Marx was able to index the experience of specific forms of class-based interpersonal domination and objective alienation, that is, the power of the boss and the machine over workers, to his analysis of the structure and dynamics of capitalist accumulation. It's what he talks about in the 19th century. The production and realization of surplus value at both a micro and macro level. The problem, of course, has been, there wasn't enough math to do the micro, and then all the macro stuff still has micro foundations, but it's just a lot easier to do it, Steve Keen, et cetera, modern money theory, et cetera. It's easier to do it at the macro level because it's less difficult, let's put it that way. It has fewer barriers, let's put it that way. For subsequent Marxist thinkers concerned with the historical fate of revolution, subsumption provided a technical vocabulary with which to designate the evolving relation between specific mechanisms of power and the overall dynamics of the capitalist system, between the experience of subjection to the command of capital and the guiding tendencies of accumulation. You see, it's sort of loosely constructed, but ultimately it can go to other craziness. Well, not craziness, but, Deleuze and Guattari and blah, 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 blah. All that still fits in this overall model. A putative theory of subsumption was thereby seen to offer the key to grasping not only the objective path of capitalist development, but also subjective programs of resistance to it, thus uniting the configuration of conditions from within which revolution must emerge. So this task that has literally happened over a century or so is one that, people have been trying to tackle. And there's always critique, there's always problems, there's always reactionaries, there's all this other stuff going on, and, it's difficult to work through. This reception of subsumption within Marxist theory has been by turns bombastic and muted, creative and conservative, deployed to diagnose the epochal shifts in capitalist power over society as a whole as a linear movement through phases of formal, real, and eventually total subsumption. So here the subsumption describes as sort of a sub-path: formal, real, eventually total. Or to reaffirm the consistency of a basic logic governing every existent and possible instance of capitalist socialization, as in, and this is where we are now, or at least where you may have seen me trudging, capital-logic and value-form theory. That's kind of, that's Heinrich. It's trying to work through some of these logic, which is one of the postmodern has elements of the postmodern, et cetera, and of course value form, which is has its own interesting history. That is, interpretations of the theory have largely fallen on one side of the tension between history and system, with which our discussion began. There's little need to rehearse these debates here, save to note that whilst the latter tendency, that is system, may gain greater conceptual coherence and fidelity to Marx's text, it is the former history that has been more energizing for critical debates, capturing the generalized, if fuzzy, sentiment that capitalist power has evolved and intensified to such a degree that it now invades and interferes with every aspect of our lives, offering no apparent way out. Kind of seemed like that yesterday, which in the struggle session, and I was going, God, you know, hope does not spring eternal. Real subsumption, accordingly, has for many come to stand as a catchword for the imperious enclosure of life by capital. Like the map described in Borges' fragment, which entirely covers the territory it represents, coinciding with it point for point. So people who talk about Borges in a spatial way also see this as, having some sort of elegiac or romantic element to it. Best talked elsewhere, but it's interesting to invoke Borges in this context. Anyway, but then again, this is a Latin approach, I think. So therefore, Borges just sort of always gets thrown in to be cynical about that. No longer restricted in its effects to the rationalization of discrete labor processes, capital's logic of coercion and technical efficiency would, on this reading, penetrate and transform to the entirety of human existence, such that in Negri's, you see, we're at Hart and Negri now in terms of, their interpretation, formulation, his society itself has been converted into a factory, or in Adorno's, see, critical theory, Adorno's prognosis, the alteration of the technical composition of capital is prolonged within those encompassed and indeed constituted by the technological demands of the production process. So it seems somewhat circular and only updated with new terms. So in that sense, for some people, it's still the 19th century. It is not only the workers' labor, a specific quantum of their time, that becomes one of the modes of existence of capital here, but the workers, and indeed the non-workers' entire life. Remember what we were talking about in the Battistoni's non-human, non-worker, unpaid stuff, right? Entire lives, workers as such, individually and collectively in their inner and outer being. This conception of real, or in some variants, total subsumption, would thus encompass all that capital has done and continues to do to our world and ourselves, while simultaneously circumscribing the evaporating terrain of revolutionary possibilities, their tendential or even consummated impossibilities. See, that's this kind of vanishing point for some people. Such interpretations of subsumption imply a theoretical short circuit, right? This is just what I was talking about, whereby the logic of power specific to capitalist production is transposed onto the social totality in an unmediated and absolutized way, right? Fully automated luxury communism, recall that, right? Sacrificing a nuanced operation of Marx's critical apparatus in favor of a sensational rhetorical diagnosis of the present. So, rhetoric elements are here and also equally problematic. Lest you think that's unimportant, that's the whole point of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Is it's an argument about rhetorical force ultimately, and its viability, and of course the fact that it's executed in a problematic way. But anyway, those who have sought to demonstrate the misreading of Marx at stake in these attempts to map formal subsumption and real subsumption onto historical phases of capitalist society have, by contrast, toiled to reinsert the theory of subsumption into a systematic account of capital. Footnote 8. Yet the difficulty here is that while different forms of subsumption in production do not directly correspond, this is the current problem, do not directly correspond to distinct phases of global capitalist development, those forms, in particular real subsumption, do have profound transformative effects that ripple outward through the broader sphere of life, reshaping the overall context of social action and struggle. Now, one way you could argue that is gun ownership, but that gets really far off. The secure theoretical footing offered by a systematic approach of capital's being essentially remains silent on the question of capital's historical becoming and overcoming, other than through an affirmation of the unchanging laws and tendency of accumulation which supposedly govern its developmental trajectory. The result is a decoupling of the system from its history, which freezes it in time. Now, you could argue, and I'm not going to argue it here, is that, we're maybe at a frozen moment. I can argue for it, but I'm not going to work it out fully. But the fact that people have brought back the Red Scare with a total ignorance of what Red Scare was or is, and it freezes us in a current time where some people, some politicians, will demonize communists without knowing what communism is, and they present the alternative, or the teleological alternative, and that is good fascism or good authoritarianism, which is stupid. It thus becomes clear that despite their apparent opposition, both interpretations of subsumption, the systematic and the historicist, reinforce the idea that at an ideological and practical level, capital has effectively achieved the suppression of its own subjection to historical finitude, which is essentially what I just said. In doing so, they severed the critical analysis of capitalism from the constructive problem of its revolutionary overcoming, that is, aborting Marxism's central task. To interpret subsumption from either a purely historical or systemic perspective undermines precisely what is theoretically forceful, and unique about the category of subsumption with respect to this task. Subsumption has a privilege because it marks the interface between capital as system and capital as history, whereas categories such as value, commodity, and capital are internal to the totality of capitalist form-determinations. Subsumption designates the point of articulation between this organic system and process and the historical substance through which it lives, which it must absorb and reform in order to exist. So what this sentence does is describe the negation of I would assert that it describes partially the negation of the negation. Now, I'm at the end of my time, so I'm going to stop here. And I think I'm about halfway, and we'll try and finish this tomorrow, lest you think that whatever. I'll finish this tomorrow. It does sound a little more technical. It also sounds circular. It sounds vague. It not enough material examples, although I've tried to throw a few in there. It are the part of the current problem, and one which academics like to say, well, we're just sort of we're just stuffing more wine in the old bottles again. But I like to think that a new generation has come to appreciate the contradictions, the dissonance, the misuse and abuse, the exploitation, the questions of force and power. All those things are there. So we will get to the end tomorrow. That we're about halfway through today. So we will get to the end. This is a piece by Andres Sanz de Cecilia, postdoctoral researcher at the College of Philosophy of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the UNAM, and an associate lecturer at Central St. Martin's, which also is interesting because Central St. Martin's, as I recall, is an art school in London. But anyway, so I'm done. I will now, if